It's so great to see you all today, and thank you so much for joining us for today's program. My name is Nina, and I'm the Curator of Programs and Interpretation here at the Williams College Museum of Art. And it is just my absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual series of curatorial close looks. I'm especially delighted to introduce today's program featuring the wonderful Kameelah Janan Rasheed, the artist and learner behind our site-specific installation, Worshipping at the Altar of Certainty, which is now on view at the Williams College Museum of Art. Kameelah is joined today by exhibition co-curators Mallory Cohen, Nidhi Gandhi, and Elyse Mack, all who are Williams College Graduate Program alumni, class of 2020, and all of whom participated in the graduate program's contemporary curatorial workshop, which was led by WICMA's Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs, Lisa Doran. Before I turn it over to our wonderful presenters, I have just a few quick logistical notes. Today's conversation will run just over an hour, and we will be taking questions throughout the program, so please do send your questions over to us at any point through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom navigation bar. And if you have any technical questions or need any assistance, please send questions through the chat feature and we'll do our best to help you. Live captioning is also available during the program and can be turned on or off through the live transcript button at the bottom of your navigation, and that button has a CC on it. The presentation today will also be recorded and will be made available on the museum's website and through our YouTube channel. Before we begin, I'd also like to share that I am presenting to you today from Williams College, which stands on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of the region now called Williamstown, Massachusetts. Following tremendous hardship, after being forced from their valued homelands, they continued as a sovereign nation in Wisconsin, which is where they reside today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. As always, I encourage all of you joining us this afternoon from various regions, and we would love to hear where it is you are tuning in from. Please share that in the chat. To please spend time and learn with and connect with the indigenous people of your own areas. With that, I am now delighted to turn things over to Elyse, Nidhi, Mallory, and Kameelah. We are also sharing some additional biographical information about our fantastic speakers through the chat feature. We will start off with a bit of introduction today to the installation and its development before diving into conversation, just to give everyone a sense of the show if you haven't seen it yet. And we will be opening up to audience questions toward the second half of the program. But please do feel free to share your questions at any time during the chat, and we'll fold those in as we go. And with that, I would love to ask Mallory to start us off and come on screen, introduce herself, and start by sharing some context about what drew the curatorial team to Kameelah's work and some of the themes of the show as it has been presented and installed.
Great, thanks, Nina. Hi to all who are Zooming in for our program this afternoon. My name is Mallory Cohen, and I am Zooming in from outside of Los Angeles. So just to sort of kind of briefly reiterate what Nina said, so this exhibition grew out of a course that the three of us curators on this Zoom call, as well as our curatorial colleague, Sinclair Spratley, who couldn't be here today, took in the Williams graduate program called CCW, or Contemporary Curatorial Workshop. And I could speak at gross length about all sort of the different parts of Kameelah's practice that we were originally excited about when we asked her to do this show. But one of the central reasons that we were really so excited to work with her is because of how her work really interrogates on a really sort of close and granular level different systems of knowing and learning, which, you know, we found so fitting for us as graduate students on a personal level, but more broadly and perhaps more importantly, incredibly fitting for a college art museum at Williams College. So at the core of Kameelah's practice is this notion that learning is never done, that we can constantly think, constantly interrogate, constantly investigate, and that it's impossible at the end of the day to know something in a complete or total way. So I just wanted to take just a couple seconds to sort of orient everybody here on this call to, kind of the physical layout itself, just because I imagine that many people won't be able to see the show in person. So as you can see in this image, the exhibition takes place in WICMA's Rotunda, which Elyse will get into the significance of in just a moment. But so Kameelah inserted this kind of central sculpture, but all of those, columns are part of WICMA's original architecture. And she also added, and would you mind just switching to the next slide? Thank you. So Kameelah also added these sort of framed images, which we'll have closer looks at later on, in addition to these sort of small pieces of paper, which are fragments from, images as well as sort of fragments from different texts. And we can kind of talk about that source material later on. Can we go to the next slide, Nina? Thank you. And you'll see those, sort of adhered to the walls all over the rotunda space. And then one additional thing that I want to draw your attention to that might be difficult to see from this photo is the text along the baseboards. If you could move to the next slide as well. Thank you. So the rotunda is a circular space. And so this text was added sort of along the lines of the baseboards all around, kind of encouraging people to sort of walk in this circular motion. And we'll talk about, that movement as well later in our conversation. So Kameelah, put all of these kind of different, sort of on a broad, I guess, kind of a broad, we're sort of zooming out here, put all these kind of different pieces of information into this space. And sort of the broader point being that, there's no way to piece all of this information into a coherent whole, or, perhaps better said, that there's, kind of a multitude of ways that one can piece together, all these different pieces sort of serving as kind of a broader metaphor for learning. So I'm going to turn it over to Elyse, who's going to talk about the historical significance of the rotunda.
Thank you so much, Mallory. My name is Elyse Mack. I use she, her pronouns. Thank you all for coming. Mallory, thanks for that fantastic intro to the show. I'm so eager to chat with you all about the process of being in the archives with Kameelah and being in this space, working with someone who pays such attention to site specificity. And I'm showing you this image right now, which is an image of the building that WICMA currently resides in as it was originally intended, which was as the college's first library. And I did not know this even a year and a half into my career at Williams until Kameelah came to Williamstown. And as soon as she arrived, the conversation was lively and ever moving, which I think you'll all be delighted to see as Kameelah joins us in conversation in just a few moments. But really sitting down and looking at images of the college's first library in the very rotunda where the work was going to ultimately end up was such a special process. And this image might be kind of hard to see. There are 3 placards above the 3 bookcases that you see with a painting in center. And those bookcases are labeled metaphysics, sermons, and mathematics. And this really sort of spun a lot of our conversation in the few days that Kameelah got to spend with us on campus, that we got to spend with her on campus. And I think really provided such a wonderful introduction to me and to us as a curatorial team to what it means when Kameelah says she's a learner. Hopefully we'll speak a little bit more in depth about that soon. But it also, I think, was such a fascinating time to talk about learning and learning for learning's sake, and what it meant to be in a space while learning, because the moment that Kameelah visited campus was, I believe, the 1st or 2nd week of March of 2020. And I have not been back to the Rotunda since. I believe Mallory also hasn't been back. So obviously COVID played a part in shaping this exhibition. And I think that I will at this point transition to my dear colleague Nidhi to speak to you a little bit more about the installation process.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Elyse. Hi, everyone. I'm Nidhi, and I'm joining from the Bay Area in Northern California. And I think, this is a great point to bring in a little bit more information about also our curatorial process, because we basically ended up spending a year and a half talking to Kameelah and just in conversation because of COVID. And we were finally able to install the show this past summer. And when we did that, we made the unusual choice to wait until after the exhibition was installed to write the curatorial text, because we'd so thoroughly talked through the ideas behind the exhibition with Kameelah, but we actually barely knew what the space would be like and look like. So watching Kameelah install the exhibition turned out to be crucial, because what we didn't understand before was how embodied some of these ideas that Elyse and Mallory have so eloquently described are in her process. So here I've included an image of a small portion of one wall of the exhibition, which shows certain words connected on the wall in an opaque manner. When we were installing, Kameelah brought this large stack of papers to install and cut out individual words, then walked around and taped them and images in this kind of wandering and meditative way. The next image actually shows kind of that each of these pieces of paper taped to the wall. So you can imagine kind of the process of her wandering, her eye wandering and her feet wandering as she was taping up these small and large pieces and making connections. So to watch her put these up gave us a whole new sense of her practice and really did change what we felt needed to be discussed in the curatorial text. We particularly realized over the course of those conversations and over the course of install, how important reflecting scholarly process was to us in writing the text. The next image is a great image from her recent interview with Art 21. Nina, if you could go to the next image. So this is actually from an Art 21 interview that recently came out, which I highly recommend everyone watches. But I love this image because it shows how absolutely surrounded by books she is in her home space and home studio. I think it kind of shows how she really thinks with writers in a literal and a conceptual sense. So when we wrote our curatorial text, we decided we should signal to this kind of scholarly process ourselves. Could you move to the next slide, Nina? And so this isn't a great image, but we chose to include footnotes and quotes from two thinkers that came up regularly in our conversations with her in the curatorial text. Again, this isn't a great image, so I hope you all will have a chance to go to the space, read the curatorial text, and wander around and get a sense of kind of the embodied nature of these concepts and this process that Kameelah used during installation. With that, I think I'd like to invite Kameelah and Mallory and Elyse back on screen. And Kameelah, if you could maybe give just a brief intro and then we'll jump into questions.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I'm joining from my living room in Brooklyn, New York. And behind me, you'll see Mulder and Scully from X-Files. They're always with me. So yeah, I wanted to also thank the entire WITMA team. This was definitely like a protracted process. And I'm really excited that through that process, I got to know all of these wonderful folks. And so just like a quick overview before you get into questions, like +1 to everything that was already said. And I think the only thing that I would add to sort of complement what they've already said is that in a lot of ways, the protracted nature of this allowed for me to go through a protracted thinking process that I think deepened the work and deepened the conversation and sort of just deepened my understanding of my practice as a learner. And so you'll see tons of work in here that includes these like large scale archival inkjet prints and these smaller pieces of paper. And as Nidhi noted, I was basically walking around for days with headphones and sort of like wandering from pillar to post, literally, and sort of like working through that process. And so I really enjoy being embodied and physically engaged in the installation process. And I liken it to a bit of a dance that you're doing in this space. And so I know we're going to get into the architecture of the space shortly, so I won't spill too much now. But yeah, just thank you again to all of you guys. It's been really great working with you. And I hope that we keep working with each other in some capacity. I think we work well together.
Well, thank you so much, Kameelah. And I'm glad that site specificity was on your mind too, because that's what our first question is about. We were certainly thinking about installations in the past that you've done that are so site specific, like scoring the stacks at the Brooklyn Public Library. And I was wondering if you could speak a little more with us about why the WICMA Rotunda in particular was an exciting site for you as an artist.
Yeah, so I remember when I first visited, and I remember some of you all being like, so we're just letting you know it's not a traditional space. So just like forewarning you, like some of the walls are goofy and it's a different place. And so one of the first places we went was we went to the WICMA to see the space, but we also went to the library to sort of look at the collections. And in that process, saw some like historical images of the Rotunda space. And just got really excited about being a multi-purpose space over the years, but also just excited about the shape. And so the thing that I really like about the shape is that you end up having to sort of circumambulate in the space in ways that is not actually provided in sort of a more traditional art gallery or museum space that it's just like a square or a rectangle. So I got really excited about that. And I also got really excited about sort of like these moments of opening. So you having this like opening for this pathway and having things situated within that opening. And then I got super excited about like, what does it mean to document a space like this where you actually cannot document the entire show in one shot, right? And so I've done so many shows where like you can take 2 shots, you got the whole thing. This show, you actually can never, ever get all the work in one shot. And so I was super excited about what it meant to install a body of work that to a certain extent refused documentation and these very traditional ways of like having a full-on shot. But I also got really excited about the possibility of different sight lines and how different sight lines impact what's knowable, what's seeable, which I thought was an interesting analogy to like how our sight line, whether it be sort of our subjectivity or subjectivities that we don't even know that we're engaged with, impact what we can see and make sense of. And so coming into the space, when I do site-specific work, one of the more interesting things for me is to spend time in the space, just sort of like walking around and literally feeling how it feels and sort of thinking about where people linger, where people don't linger. And so coming into this space here at WICMA, I got excited about the circular nature, which reminded me of circumambulation, which reminded me of like literal planetary orbits, which reminded me of this process of wandering, and wanted to sort of think about how the architecture of space could also be a protagonist in this work and not so much something I'm working against, but I could be like, no, like we're going to collaborate with one another to sort of create the space. And we didn't use audio, but there is something about sort of the sound and echo of the space that feels cavernous to a certain extent. That's really, really interesting to me. And there's tons of things that happen with lighting too, because of the dome structure. So yeah, I don't know. This is one of my most fun places to have installed work because it was a fun challenge. I like challenge-based making. So yeah.
So glad you enjoyed the challenge. I'm wondering, Nina, if you could click back a couple of slides. Yes, this is amazing. That sense of the space being the protagonist, Kameelah, is something that I think is captured really beautifully in this image. This is for those who haven't had the chance to see the work, one of the archival prints that is framed on the wall in the space, and reflected in it is both one of the columns that is in the space all the time and the sculpture in the center of the room that Kameelah created. It really, for me, sort of brings to light the sense of circularity, text, the multiple scales at which your work functions. There's a lot to really wander in, if you will. And that concept is something that I was hoping you might speak with us a little bit more about too, what wandering meant to you before, during, and after the process of installing this show.
Yeah, and I just one more note about this image is that because I think we use like a museum plexiglass, there's also something really beautiful about sort of like the warping of the reflection, right? And I think that this works well thematically as well in terms of thinking about the sense that we have is that when we look at something, we're always getting like what it actually is, but there's always some type of like warping or stretching or hyperbole or something else is going on. And so I just think there are always moments of like reflective materials throughout the show that end up working really well. And I don't want to take credit for this because in a lot of ways, so many of the things that happen in the installation process and in the process of like making the work and installing the work were like fun accidents, which is why I think, again, the protracted nature of this, in addition to the fact that like we were in the space installed for such a long period of time, gave us a chance to like see these things happen and then be able to be like, oh, that makes sense. So yeah, I'm really happy that you brought this image in. And I think to the point around wandering, yeah, I feel like my entire life has been like a series of wanderings. And I gave a talk yesterday and someone asked like what my life goals and expectations were. And I actually kind of laughed because I, to a certain extent, from my like early days, like I'm going to be an educator, I'm going to teach, I'm going to do this. There was like a lot of clarity about that, but I still ended up wandering in a lot of directions, and I feel so grateful because that wandering allowed for me to engage with other disciplines, people, experiences, ways of working that I would not have experienced had I just stuck to a path and didn't go anywhere else. And so I think wandering for me is like a form of like chosen pleasure, right? Particularly when it goes up against notions of like what we should be doing to be productive under capitalism, what we should be doing to be productive and notable adults, what we should be doing to be productive and responsible people, right? It's this assumption that you can't wander, you can't go on a tangent. And so I think in a lot of ways when people are sort of engaged with me around like, what are my goals as an artist? Yesterday I said, I just want to have fun. And I know that's not the right response in a certain way, because like, I just want to do things that are fun, right? Like this exhibit was fun, right? In the sense that like, I got to play in space. I got to like literally run back and forth. It was fun. And so I think that wandering for me means an engagement with a certain type of pleasure. Around Saidiya Hartman talks about like waywardness all the time in her most recent text. There's a particular type of waywardness that I appreciate. And Ashton Crawley talks about this around centrifugativity. There's a certain type of moving in and out and being undone that I really appreciate. And so I think wandering is just like being on the move and being open to a certain type of learning that's not predicated on like an accumulation of credits, but a learning that can happen through anything, any type of experience. And there's a book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which I keep reading parts of and never finish. And so that's cool. But I'm wandering through that text, and one of the things that one of the problems I'm having is I keep stopping and being like, I need to think about this for 12 months. But one part that's most interesting to me is this section where the writer and Braiding Sweetgrass says, if I'm remembering correctly, that humans are the youngest, right? We're the youngest on the planet. And so because of that, we must look to our elders, non-humans, plants, fungi, all these other things as teachers, right? And so there's something really beautiful to me about the notion of wandering being like interspecies, in the sense of like, I'm wandering through all these experiences, but I'm also keeping myself open and attuned to like what I can learn from the plant. What can I learn from a plant through phototropism? Plants engage in phototropism, they grow towards the light. Like, what can I learn from that, right? What can I learn from plants that have learned to adapt and, create these underground fungi networks to communicate? There are just so many things we can learn from non-humans. And so I think to wrap this up, this wandering, as I'm wandering through this, I'm just interested in sort of like the pleasure of being open to all the learning possibilities and thinking about what does it mean to be primed for all types of learning, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful.
And if I could just pop in really fast, I feel like the four of us plus Sinclair talked a lot about, especially like when you were doing those early site visits, about kind of the symbolism of, this exhibition of wandering specifically for Williams and sort of this notion that, you know, whether you're working at an undergrad or graduate level, there's this idea that you take a class and you do your research, and at the end, there's always this kind of, you know, presentation and kind of the performance of knowledge and performance of completeness, and how you're really sort of invested in destabilizing that. And I think that everything that you just said speaks to that so well. Cool. Elyse, is there anything else you wanted to ask, or no? Okay. Cool. So I'll take the next question. Okay, so this I think speaks super well also to what you just said. So you often describe yourself as a learner before perhaps describing yourself as an artist. And we would love to hear from you sort of more about, you know, how your process and mentality has maybe shifted over the last 2 years, you know, kind of in regards to just, you know, how long, you know, this exhibition sort of took to plan and then was sort of postponed because of COVID, and, you know, how this kind of delayed opening. But we're also wondering, you know, what has stayed the same? And you mentioned, I also just sort of as like kind of one concrete thing. You mentioned specifically, you know, in an earlier conversation that one of the things that's really come out of the last 2 years for you has been being able to think more deeply with Sean Crawley's work. So I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I keep harping on this like protracted exhibition schedule because I actually think in a lot of ways, the accident of it is quite the ideal or model, right? This notion that a team of, and we're going to talk about teams of curators at the end of this, so I'm not going to like get too deep in this, but like the idea of working with a team of curators over a period of time to think about the work was so important to me. So I think there's two things, right? There's like spending a lot of time to make work and think about the work, make the work, revise the work, and then sharing it after a long period of time. Then there's also this process of making the work and then being able to contextualize it differently over time. And I think that there's something really, really fascinating to me about not being caught up in the object itself, but being sort of like enthralled by the notion that the more that I learn and make sense of, the more that I can imbue the object that I created with like a different type of meaning, or at least articulate that. So I think there's a certain extent where I think there's like a fetish around the object that takes forever to make. And I would say that I'm a quick maker in the sense of like, I'll have an idea and I'll be playing around, I'll make something. I'm a quick maker, but then I need like 5 years to think about it. Where versus like needing 5 years to make something and then only needing a few days to think about it. And so I think one of the things that has changed for me is sort of thinking about my workflow in terms of like, where do I actually need the most time, right? And so I find myself now, when I'm applying for things and thinking about like what I need as an artist, I'm like, actually, I don't need you guys to give me money to make stuff. I just need you guys to give me money to read books for like a couple years and like figure out what I've already made, like what that actually means. And so I think it's really helped me shape how I ask for things and advocate for myself when I work with other people. And so I think that has been a big shift, and I feel so appreciative of that. I think what has stayed the same is that like I'm still deeply interested in the ways that learning happens across different institutions. And I'm trying to make sense of the ways in which people learn at hyperlocal levels and the ways that people learn in macro institutions, and then being like, oh, if everyone is learning really, really, really differently and in different ways and have different interests and have different entry points and have different epistemologies for making sense of the world, what exactly is a university designed to do? And there's this question of like, what is the university and what is it designed to do that I keep coming back to? And so Ashton Crawley's work has been like very, very formative in me thinking about interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, non-disciplinary, antidisciplinary work. But it also helps me think about the importance of like holding knowledge outside of universities and not allowing universities to become the center of like our knowledge production ecosystem, because I think that there's a certain disciplining and domestication of knowledge that happens when it needs to be codified in a certain way in order to be received and made sense of in a certain way. And so there is this one essay that I keep returning to. It's Maria Inigo Clavel's essay from, I want to say April 2020 on eFlux, where she's talking about the untranslatable, and she talks a lot about sacred practices and knowledge and like translation. And there's so much that's being said in that essay that I keep returning to, because I think that she's doing such an amazing job of like actually pushing up, whether implicitly or explicitly, against the notion of the university as the only place in which knowledge, legitimate knowledge, is produced, and pushing up against the notion of a university as the only, as a place of embodied learning, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think I've been thinking a lot more about embodiment and learning and the role of the university and the ways in which I'm an adjunct in many institutions, and the responsibility I have to sort of push up against what my role is as an instructor, and what my role is within a university. I said a lot of words, but I've been learning a lot in this process. So hopefully those words all came together into sensible things.
I also just kind of wanted to follow up. I was just sort of, we were talking about kind of the untranslatable and kind of how, you know, that links as well to sort of what you were saying earlier about this exhibition, maybe refusing documentation and kind of refusing, you know, refusing that like flattening into a photographic image, I think is really interesting. But you had also written something recently that said that you don't feel compelled, or sort of exploring what it means to not feel compelled to have all communication make sense to all people. And I thought that was kind of I'd love for you to say a little bit more about that. I thought that was kind of another really interesting layer to maybe what you were just describing.
Yeah, and this is the problem with reading a lot of things and then being like, oh, I need to figure out how they're all connected. So I'll do like a quick, like Octavia Stowe Butler talks about primitive hypertext and this way of like connecting all these disparate things. Like if you're reading a book on like whales, but you're also like trying to figure out this like sci-fi thing in your story, she's like, just open all the books and just be in all the books and like see what happens. And so I think to this question that you just posed, around like having not all communication being for everyone. In Ashton Crowley's essay around the B3 Hammond, he talks about this very particular historical document. It's Bilal's diary. He was enslaved in the South, and he was Muslim and wrote Arabic, but there's this diary or this document that was found, and that most of it's been translatable, but there's a section that Ashton Crowley mentions in the center of the text that like is impenetrable. Like like people are like, what is it? Like, how is it that I can understand all this and then I just get stuck here and I can't figure it out, and then it picks up again, right? And so I always find this sort of beautiful trickster moment of like making everything really available and then being like, just kidding, we're gonna take it back. And so Ashton Crowley talks about this in a lot of ways. He talks about it in the context of like the nonsensical or the seemingly nonsensical not being nonsensical to everyone. So like that nonsense in that middle may have made complete sense to someone that Ben Ali knew or Bilal knew, but that doesn't make sense to anyone else because they don't have the cultural context to make sense of it, right? There's also these questions around like sort of protection and privacy and interiority that Zorna Hurston talks about, that Kevin Quaishi talks about, that tons of people talk about. And so I think that when I'm thinking about communication, there are a couple of things that come up for me, right? So whenever we speak, the intention is that we're speaking because we want to communicate something to someone else, right? So I'm not like jibber jabbering about nonsense right now because the intention is that everyone who has shown up to this can actually understand what I'm talking about, right? That imperative means that anytime that we are speaking in a way that does not become translatable is rendered as like noise or nonsensical, something that we shouldn't pay attention to. And so I think in my practice and in my work, I'm really interested in like, what are the other possibilities of speaking that are not sort of organized around legible communication. And so Ashton Crowley talks about this a bit when he talks about like notions of like, what if you're just speaking to have an ecstatic experience that's like no one else's but yours? What if you're just speaking and engaging in something because you were just filled with joy? What are the other ways basically, and that I'm in relationships work, I'm thinking about what are the other ways that he is talking about what else can a text do besides communicate information? What else can speech do besides communicate information? Can text just be beautiful without communicating information? Can speech just be like lovely to listen to without communicating legible information? So I'm really interested in this like very soft line between the legible and illegible, but I'm also really interested in like notions of interiority and secret languages, because I do think like one of the greatest joys and beauties of to me about language is both its ability to reveal so much, but also to hide so much. And I think that lots of conversations around like democracy in the future have been organized around like, once we reach complete transparency, this is the point at which everything will be great. But I'm also kind of like, even in the most just future, I still want to be able to talk to like whoever, and to be able to have like a shield of like interiority and privacy around that. And so I'm really interested in like literal and figurative transparency and opacity for that reason. And just thinking about, are there other ways that we can engage with language and text that is not organized around this compulsion to like understand, own, turn into a book, turn into a university course, but like, can we just speak and then leave and not record the thing and just like go on with our lives?
I think that's, been so key to what we've, the exhibit as a whole, and hopefully what we have hoped students and audience members gain from wandering around in this exhibit is this embrace of uncertainty. I think, we've talked a lot together about the idea of uncertainty and really being okay in sitting in that and mulling in that. And I think it's kind of funny because throughout this whole process, we've also been completely uncertain about when this is going to go up, how this is going to happen, what it's going to look like. And so from like a practical standpoint, I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about like, enabling uncertainty in a space, especially because, you made these prints in 2020, early 2020. And so you kind of solidified ideas in that and had to kind of work with those solidified ideas, even as we're talking a lot about uncertainty. So yeah, how have you kind of grappled with that, maintaining that level of uncertainty in a practical sense, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, so I will start at 2018. I won't make this long. I promise it'll be short. But I'm mentioning this because I think that I've been talking about uncertainty and revision in my practice for quite some time. And I think it's such a sexy curatorial idea, such a sexy art idea. But then when you actually have to like live it, you're like, oh shit, I don't want this. Sorry, excuse my language. You're right. That's actually the response, is like, I don't actually want uncertainty. I want everything to be perfect and do what I asked it to do, right? And so I mentioned this because in 2018, I published a book. It had a bunch of errors in it. There's like some printings, like it happened, right? And so I went into like a very bad depression in summer 2018 because there was like this very clear gap between like what I was talking about and what I was thinking about around revision, uncertainty, and non-resolution, and then how I was actually living my life, right? Like it was cute until it happened to me. And when it happened to me, I was like, what? That's not what I said. And so going into 2019, we republished the book, and we basically leaned into the fact that this is a republication of a book that had errors. The Artist Talk talked about it, and almost every talk that I give, I talk about this because it was such an important moment, and thinking about the ways in which the ideas that we talk about in our work actually become like the ethos that like actually animates our life. And one thing that has become increasingly important to me is making sure that there is the least amount of a gap between what I am saying is important to me and how I'm living my life. And so when it came to this show and we had to push it back because of COVID, and then we were trying to figure out other things around school calendars, I actually felt very calm. So I was like, I have an amazing team of curators. They're going to figure it out. So I felt very calm and supported in that, right? But also it's kind of like, there's nothing that can go wrong in this situation, because literally the show is about being able to learn from these moments, right? And so I was just sort of like, oh, this is so amazing. We planned this. We planned this exactly like this. We wanted it to be a 2-year long process, right? And so I feel very grateful about that, because I think that how often do we actually get to live out the ideas that we talk about in our work in a real way in terms of both the process and the product and sort of like the aftermath of it, right? And so I just feel grateful that I'm talking about uncertainty, and there's so much uncertainty in life right now, so much. And I think that there's been this like very interesting surrender and being like, like, did you really think you had control? Because that's really cute. And sort of like being able to swing back. And so I think the major learning for me from both the book project and from this, and I'm sure as we go on in the future, is like, because P5, Prospect 5 was also delayed as well because of both COVID and when we had Hurricane Ida. And so there are all these things that are happening. And I was just sort of like sitting here like this, being like, we're all going to learn. And people are like, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, we're all going to learn. It's just going to be an amazing learning experience. And so, yeah, I just feel very grateful that, I feel very grateful that my work is not a performance of an idea that is actually not important to me, if that makes sense. I'm not performing uncertainty. Like the show was literally the uncertainty. And the process was literally the uncertainty. And so I think that as I think about my art practice, trying to get closer and closer to moments where those things are close together. Like they touch each other versus being a concept and a thing. It's like the concept and the thing come together.
Yeah, I love this because I think 100% we started this as graduate students, and you know, for us, learning to sit in uncertainty felt very untaught to us. And so being able to have the opportunity, obviously at first we were like, oh my God, we hate this. But in reality, it was an immense learning experience. And I know that, you know, we've gotten to talk now over the course of this conversation and in the past about how much you have taken away from this experience. Do you want to talk a little bit about any upcoming projects you have and how you're what you've done in this project and kind of working with this level of uncertainty on a practical level, but also conceptual level is translating to upcoming projects?
Yeah, so the book that I mentioned, I'm currently producing the third iteration of that book because now I've decided to make it a lifelong project of being like, oh, what if, because I will just note that even the 2019 book had errors in it. And it was hilarious because I was like, are you kidding me? Right? But the interesting thing about this is that having this like text to keep returning, to be able to return back to has been really lovely. So I'm working on this like third edition of the text, and I'm trying to think about this as sort of like a lifelong project of like every 2 to 3 years, I like come back to revise this text and thinking I'm like envisioning this like stack of text until the day that I sort of like transition from this earthly plane of just like books that have been revised over and over. So that's one thing that I'm working on. I'm also in the middle of like a public arts project for the city of New York for a Percent for Art project. And that's like there's tons of revision and delays and like weird stuff that happens because you're working with such a large network of people to get something done. But that's been a lot of uncertainty from like the approval process to like the reapproval process to like finding materials. And so a lot of this has been like, what does it mean to create a loose perimeter around like what needs to happen and what can't happen, but within that perimeter being able to move around, because I don't believe in precarity for precarity's sake, but I do believe in precarity that is generative. Like I don't think poverty as a form of precarity is generative. But I do think in the context of like a university or institution that's very used to like having the work a year in advance, having the title, having all that stuff to actually push up against to say like, what space is there for an artist to actually be thinking up until the point of installation? That's really important. And I want to just come back to Nidhi, what you said about the fact that like writing the text and revising the text after seeing the work was so important, because I went back and looked at the text that we had thought about before, and I was like, that's not what we're doing. But we would have not known that unless we had gone through the process. And so I think that in a lot of these upcoming projects, I'm thinking a lot about how do I work with existing systems around how time, space, and processes are organized, actually, again, ensure that this interest in uncertainty, productive and generative uncertainty, finds its way into all aspects of that. So there's that, and there's like a show coming up in Hanover that requires me to like basically figure out how to install and organize a show across water. That's been really interesting. So yeah, I think there's tons of stuff that's coming up that's really helping me think about uncertainty, but also like being mindful that not everyone functions well under those conditions, and like what types of compromises and conversations you have to have, because it's not just about me. We're all working together. So yeah, you guys seem primed for uncertainty. We can't guarantee that for anyone else.
Yeah. So before we transition to audience Q&A, Kameelah, do you have a question for us you want to ask?
I have tons of questions for you, but I've been told I can only ask one. So the one question I will ask was around this group curatorial process. And I'm asking this question because I think there's a lot of like stuff in the art world where it's like a single curator has put together this amazing thing. And some of my favorite curators that I've worked with have talked about collaboration or whatever form. And it's always been those experiences that have been most exciting. So I'll mention like when I work with Cora Fisher at Brooklyn Public Library, like we collaborated hardcore for months to put something together. When I work with Meg Only over at ICA Philadelphia, like there is a very involved collaborative process. And so, and I'm not mentioning all the curators that I've ever worked with. I love everyone I've worked with. I'm just mentioning the ones that immediately came to mind. But I say that all that to say, the question for me is like, to what extent you guys think about collaborative curatorial practices as sort of the future of curation. And I'm thinking about this in the context of not just curators coming together, but like curators and people from other fields coming together. Yeah, like what do you think is the future of like collaborative curatorial practices?
Who wants to start?
I mean, okay, firstly, you can ask us as many questions as you want. We didn't mean to be like one question. I mean, one of the things that I love about this question though is that I think that it gets at kind of this sort of non-hierarchical collaborative process, sort of destabilizing this notion that sort of, there's one person at the top and they kind of have the knowledge and they will sort of, be the mastermind of this exhibition that people can attend, but sort of rather, having it, instead of being, a hierarchy that's like this, having it being more of a field that's like this. And I mean, one of the things that was so exciting, for me about working with Nidhi and Elyse and Sinclair was that, we all have different interests. Everybody is bringing something different to the table. And, and it's great to hear from people who have those different perspectives. And you can also come into a meeting and be like, I have this great idea. And everybody else will be like, no. But like, that's also valuable, I don't know if Elyse or Nidhi, if you want to say anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Kameelah, I think this question's so generous and looking towards the future of collaboration, because I'm thinking about like projects that I see that I'm the most excited about, like the Feral Atlas, like these are all like collaborative, interdisciplinary, like projects that have a sharing of knowledge at the core, not like this sense of ultimate accomplishment. And I think something that like, what I hope to take away from the process of working on this show and working in collaboration, not just with my co-curators who I love, but also with you, Kameelah, is this sense that like, you are never going to see the whole thing at once. Like, and whether you're talking about a show, an object, its past and present and future, like a collaboration, like a museum, like not yourself and life and presence in the world, you're never going to see it all at once. And that like striving for some sense of like ultimate understanding or completeness perhaps is not what's going to make me or any of us happy at the end of the day. And so I really am just so appreciative of that new like sense of what not only collaboration, but like success and productivity and like getting something out of the work has meant. Nidhi, I don't know if you had more thoughts.
Yeah, this might be like, this has become something I feel very passionately about, because I think that when we started this process as a kind of collaborative curatorial work, we didn't necessarily know what that would entail. And it has required this amazing balance between generosity and honesty that I feel like is so crucial, but so hard to get people on board with in the real world. And I've been very lucky that not only have, Elyse, Mallory, and Sinclair, and you, Kameelah, been, open to balancing generosity in terms of ideas and, receiving ideas, but also honesty about what you actually think of those ideas. But the WICMA staff have been so supportive of everything we've done. I would say that I think that all good creative work and all good museum work is necessarily collaborative. And we need to start thinking about it that way. It's not easy. I would say that I certainly learned a lot about collaboration and collaborating well over the course of this project. But if I think, it's one of the reasons that we see museum exhibitions and work being put out there that doesn't speak to the vast majority of people or the global majority, is because that work is not taking on a collaborative mindset. So I just think it's like a necessary part of the growth of creative work, of the arts, of museum work. Yeah, I think, any last thoughts?
I do just want to add, I think, Mallory, I'm thinking more about like what you said about hierarchy and thinking about the ways in which like roles that we obviously took on somewhat different roles amongst the 5 of us, and then, more and more when you start to include like WICMA staff, et cetera. But like the fact that Nidhi was the one to like text us and be like, we need to do this tomorrow, like didn't build some sort of weird like pyramid within us of power or any of the like sort of icky things that come with hierarchy. Like it was just an understanding that like Nidhi's good at motivating us and like she knows which of us is going to get which type of work done when and how, and that's an incredible strength. But it didn't like it didn't mean that Nidhi somehow had some sort of like knowledge hanging over us or power that like put the work out of whack. It was just like, this is what needs to happen to get done, and made all of us, I think, or I'll speak for me personally, made me highly motivated to contribute the ways that I could and to be honest and generous in the way that you just articulated really beautifully, Nidhi, about the process.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you all so much. This was such beautiful conversation, and I love sort of ending on this note of collaboration. I will just speak, from the staff side of working with all of you. It really has been such a joy to witness the collaborative ethos of your project and your thinking, and see how that's grown and developed over time. We do have a couple audience questions that I'd love to, allow us to speak to. To start us off, we have a wonderful note from Lisa, just thanking you all, of course, and really calling attention to the way you've described the unexpected opportunities of the attenuated timeline on the development of the project, which I think is really wonderful to hear how that helped shift, different aspects of the work. Lisa was saying, this project is going to be up for an entire academic year. It's on view for actually longer than we typically show exhibitions. So we'd love to hear you all speak a bit about how you might imagine the longer timeline of the presentation affecting the project, if at all.
I want to, before we actually get into the question, I feel like we haven't, just in terms of kind of the spirit of collaboration, I feel like this conversation has also not extended to collaborating with Lisa, who is a phenomenal, sort of advisor over the course of this project, always invested in giving us new things to think about, or I don't know, just being this kind of constant, incredible sounding board. And this would not have happened without her incredible support, as well as the support of the kind of broader WICMA team, and for that we're really grateful. So thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa.
Ditto. Thank you. I'm no good with
Uh,
that was the only
yeah.
way that logistically this was going to happen. I was like, I do ideas. Showing up for meetings? What is that? The idea person.
Regarding how the year-long aspect of this show being up, yeah, it's really interesting because that was not originally the plan. And we are kind of still in some ways early on into it being up. You know, one of the things that I think back to when we were originally planning to install in April 2020, very immediately afterwards, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement took off, the murder of George Floyd happened, COVID obviously happened. These all completely changed our perspective on the material and what we were thinking about in terms of kind of the reflection of this exhibition on the larger world around us. And so I'm kind of curious to see what happens over the next year that might affect this exhibition in the same way. And when audiences come into the exhibition, how they're perceiving these ideas of uncertainty and ideas of centrifugal thinking, of wandering, of like kind of an openness that the exhibition posits.
And I think I'm assuming this is public because it's on the website, but the work is traveling to Pomona College. And I just think it's really, I'll drop the link in here. I just think that there's also something important about thinking about the work traveling to another academic institution, right? And that this basically we get to like think about this. I don't know if this is gonna be annoying for like 4.5 years, guys. So there's just not the time frame at Wickman. There's also the time frame at Pomona, and I think that the elongated time frame also allows for us to think about public programming. And just to speak to Lisa and her role, also again, this became such a large part of the conversations we were having during installation. Like, what can we bring of this process of installation, and what can we bring of these informal conversations we've been having on site into like a public conversation? So I'm excited about long exhibition schedules because they allow for more public programming, but they allow for our relationship to the exhibition to change. And I do think it asks people to like see things and read things and engage with things multiple times over, to almost think about how their thinking is changing over a year-long period. So I feel, again, very grateful and humbled that I said this recently, and I mean this seriously. I feel grateful. I feel very emotional these days, grateful and humbled that I get to make stuff and then people look at it. It feels like such a surreal experience of like making things and then people look at them for long periods of time and then they want to look at them again. I know that seems like strange for an artist to say, but it still feels very, very surreal that I just get to make stuff and think about stuff and then people look at it and think with me. It feels like the greatest gift to be able to do that. So I appreciate all the people who make that possible because it's so surreal to me.
I know we're just about out of time, but we did have one other really great question I'd love to fold in if we have another couple minutes. And I know folks might have to leave, but we'll stay on for a few more. I did also just want to say to this question about, you know, how this duration might change. Something, you know, from my perspective, being a museum staff member and, you know, being up in the galleries, you know, every few days, every day, the presence of the work has made me think a lot about ideas about proximity and the way in which I love, just to carry a through line forward, the phrase you used before of the architecture as a protagonist. And I think thinking too about the ways in which museum spaces are kind of form and protagonist of their own that might dictate certain ways that we move through space or are asked to be embodied in the space of an institution. And I think that's true also in more broadly in spaces of higher education. There's something about your installation, Kameelah, that really, forces this closeness, that makes you have to look closely, that has to forces you to go back and return and puzzle and move through. And I think in some ways it's disruptive in a good way of the ways that a museum space might ask us to behave. And I think it's just a really, really special part of the presence here that I hope visitors and students especially will, get to experience. And I hope that will be true too at Pomona. I think some of this sort of flows into this wonderful final question, just about your use of materials, and like the source of the text that are displayed, and like where do you usually look for materials? And I think another great part of this question is also asking, was learning about the earlier contents of the former library that was in that space actually shift your process for this project? And the only other thing I'd add that I've been curious about is color. Your work isn't always black and white, but it often is. And I'd be curious if you talk about that too, and before we wrap up.
Yep, I'll start at the end and then work my back way to the beginning. So for color, I used to use more color in my practice, and then I wanted to give my point around challenge. I wanted to give myself a bit of a challenge in terms of thinking about tonality and texture. And I think that when I was using color, I was sort of cheating, right? I was sort of like, I'll use a lot of color and it'll add more texture and color. And so I actually wanted to give myself the challenge of like, how many different types of different textures and tonalities of Black can I achieve when using a Xerox machine versus a scanner? And so part of me is really interested and the contrast of the color of Black and white as this thing of like, something is Black and white, it's very clear, it's very plain, sort of like working with that assumption of like clarity, but also as people sort of, to your point on proximity, move closer to the work and move out, you actually end up seeing different textures and tonalities of the colors, right? And so by using different materials that have different opacities and layering them, you end up with different tonalities and colors and reflective qualities. By using Xerox machines and other things that we end up with different tonalities. And so I'm really interested in thinking about things that are seemingly flat or lack volume, and how that volume is understood or rendered visible through proximity, right? And so to a certain extent, when you stand far back, things can all look Black and white, but as you move in closer, you start seeing these other things. And so there is an invitation to move closer, there is an invitation to read more closely, there is an invitation to come back. And so that is one interest around Black and white. The other part of that being that when I had a residency at a print shop, I was so fascinated by using all of the resources there. I wanted to keep working. And so I bought a Xerox machine, a Black and white Xerox machine, and actually just fell in love with everything that was possible with that Xerox machine and was like, I will never return to color. I do sometimes make color moments. So there's that. And then around the source material for the show, one thing that comes up in the Art 21 video is the ways in which when I look for source material, I'm actually not looking in a particular book, be like, I want to find something written by blah, blah, blah. I am literally looking for shapes of letters that I like. Like I have a lot of books here and I will literally pick up a book and be like, I'm kind of looking for an A that gives me like this type of feeling. And so that's what I'll look for. I'm kind of looking for a the that looks like this. And so a lot of my process ends up being intuitive in the sense that like, I'll photocopy a page and just be like, I don't actually like any of the A's on this page, got to find another book. And so it's not so much about like finding an author that has something, because I'm not usually using like a whole sentence. I'm using like a word and then stitching it together. It's literally like, do I like how the letters feel and look? Is it thick enough? Is it grainy enough? So that, I think if that makes sense. And did I miss another question you had in there, Nina?
I think that's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Material sources. I think that's so interesting though, to think about how you're thinking about the form of the text, not necessarily the content. Because also I think there is often really striking content that surfaces in your work. And I think that's the beautiful, facet of it, is the puzzle of like, what is the language saying? And I think what you were saying earlier about translatability and the untranslatable, and even a resistance to the translatable, is that makes a lot of sense. That's fantastic to hear.
Now, add just one more thing, because I think one of your other questions was around the history of the space, if I remember correctly. And I remember one of the things that we did find when we went up to the library was, went up to the library to learn more about the library, was that in the library, I think there was a section where it was like mathematics and religion were side by side. I think that's the image, right? And I was so fascinated by that, because I think within both the context of religious studies and practice and within mathematics, there is a desire for a certain amount of like certainty, or a certain amount of like orthodoxy, right? Like, this is the orthodox way in which to solve a mathematical equation. This is the orthodox way to be a Muslim, a Christian, a Jewish person, right? And so I was really interested in those two disciplines being right up against each other, because I see so much similarity in the ways, in the epistemology and how things are organized. But I also thought about in a contemporary context where people might think about math as being so severely rational and religion being completely irrational, but at some point they were put next to each other in this library collection. So there are always really interesting moments of things literally and figuratively rubbing up against each other. And that tension, I think, is really important, because I think in the future university, folks would be able to engage with mathematics and religious studies and art as not as some like amazing revolutionary thing, but just as par for the course, because those disciplines are all connected. And the only way they ever became disconnected is during this very specific period of like creating universities where we thought about expertise and sort of like the function of expertise and exclusion. And so I'm really interested in a future university where the religious studies scholars are often in conversation with the mathematics scholars, and the mathematics scholars are attending art shows and thinking about like, that is the world that I want to live in. Yeah, I'll get off my education soapbox now. But
The world, I think we want to follow your vision to that. That's beautiful, and what a beautiful place to end. I wish we could just keep talking. I could talk to the group of you forever and listen to you all just share your beautiful thoughts. But I want to thank you all so much for being with us. I want to thank our audience for spending their lunchtime or midday, or depending where you are, a different time of day with us, hearing a little about the show. For those of you who can come to the area, the show will be up through the spring, and we would love to have you here. And we are also excited to plan for some future programs as well through this duration. I can't wait to see this show at Pomona. I think it's so exciting to think about this site-specific show traveling to another location, an academic location especially. So
and thing, Nina, really quickly, if you are in the area, this is always cross promotion for Mass MoCA. There's also a show at Mass MoCA about translation that I'm also included in. If you want to do a twofer while you're in the area, just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I'm dropping that in the chat. That's a beautiful show that's up over there with your work among many other amazing artists' work. So definitely worth a day trip to see both. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you all for being here with us, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Nina.
Bye.
Thank you, Kameelah.